listener production.
Hello, happy Friday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. It's a rivalry as old as time, the NRL versus the AFL. Which is better? What game is more watchable? Who is drawing the biggest crowds? Well, over the past week, the NRL and AFL bosses have been clashing over ratings, code wars and state hype. So ahead of tomorrow's AFL Grand Final, who is winning the code war?
The reality is AFL is the biggest sport in this country, but it has not won the code wars for the NRL states.
That chat coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiro. It is Friday, September 27.
Good morning, Sash. Good morning, everyone. Well done. We made it to the end of a crazy week, but no week crazier than the supermarkets in Australia because it's just going from bad to worse for them. So there's a fresh report out from the ACCC revealing grocery prices have risen 20% in the last 5 years. This interim report comes at the halfway point of the Consumer Watchdog's year-long inquiry into the supermarkets. And on the back of the report, CEOs will be called to answer questions for a second time about profit margins, promotions, and the power dynamic between them and suppliers.
Yeah, the ACCC also surveyed more than 20,000 customers as part of this investigation, and it found, unsurprisingly, I think, but concisely and decisively, that Australians have lost trust in Coles and Woolworths and they're struggling to find cheaper prices and better values when they go to the shops. Now, this report is separate, of course, from the legal action that was launched by the watchdog this week, which has accused the two grocery giants of manipulating prices and discounts. So it's been a busy week as well for the ACCC. Yesterday, they issued a $14 million fine to Energy Australia. Now, the energy retailer was accused by the watchdog of making false, misleading or deceptive statements to hundreds of thousands of consumers about electricity prices and failing to provide mandatory information that was required by the Electricity Retail Code. So Energy Australia did admit to breaching the code that affected over 560,000 customers back in 2022. So it's an example, I think, watchdogs and inquiries, and they kind of can be criticised for not having teeth. But this is an example of where the ACCC has investigated, found wrongdoing and issued a fine.
Over now to the US, where Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has urged the UN to stop the war in Gaza, calling for a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire.
Stop this crime. Stop it now. Stop the killing of children and women. Stop this genocide. Stop sending weapons to Israel. This madness cannot continue. The entire world is responsible.
That's him speaking to the UN General Assembly in New York there. He also advocated for the Palestinian Authority, which he leads, to control all Palestinian territories, promising elections once the war ended. Now, critics have pointed out that his ability to make that happen was unclear and unlikely, given the political and security obstacles, but it would be the first national elections in nearly 2 decades, Sash.
So this all comes as Benjamin Netanyahu rejected urgent calls from the US, Australia, France and other allies for an immediate 21-day ceasefire across the Israel-Lebanon border. Of course, that has flared up this week. We've seen more than 600 people killed in strikes by Israel. Hezbollah has also fired into Israeli territory. Now, Netanyahu touched down in New York yesterday ahead of his speech at the UN General Assembly. The Israeli PM telling reporters the military will continue hitting Hezbollah with, quote, full force, and we will not stop until we achieve all our goals, end quote.
Yeah, and on the sidelines of all of this, US President Joe Biden and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky have met, and Biden has announced an $8 billion package in military aid for Ukraine. So the bulk of that is dealing with mid-range weapons and additional air defenses and things that can help on the ground, soldiers on the ground. The biggest thing that Ukraine have been wanting from its allies in the West is permission to use long-range missiles and strike into Russia. Now, that's been bubbling away for quite some time, but fresh comments from Putin have come out in the last 24 hours where he is promising nuclear war against the allies if they allow this to happen. So Biden hasn't commented on it, and he said he won't be commenting on it publicly anytime soon, whether or not the US will allow Ukraine to strike into Russia.
Another interesting thing with the dynamic with Zelensky and the US at the moment is the fact that we've got an election coming up. We're about to talk about that in the next story. But if Donald Trump wins, he's made it fairly clear that he doesn't think this amount of aid should be going to Ukraine from the US. Zelensky tried to meet with Trump. He said he was going to. It doesn't look like that's happened, and it doesn't look like it is going to happen. So Zelensky will be very closely watching what happens in November, because a Trump win would likely mean an end to all the aid. And that could be devastating for Ukraine, considering how under the pump they are with Russia's invasion.
A new report is predicting a Donald Trump win in the US election this November will hurt Australia's economy. So this research, done by an Aussie economist and former Reserve Bank board member, has analysed Trump's policies and how they'd impact world economies. So, the policies in question include his plans to impose tariffs of up to 60% on all imports, incarcerate and deport over 8 million undocumented workers, and effectively overrule the Federal Reserve on US interest rate settings.
Yeah, so this analysis found that not only would those policies hurt America's economy quite significantly, there would be flow-on effects to Australia and China as well. Australia's main impact would be on the tariffs as opposed to deporting citizens, but it's worth noting that that would have a flow-on effect to us. The economists predict the US itself would plunge into a deep recession within 2 years, with much lower GDP, much higher inflation, and less people holding down a job. So a pretty damning report. Now, this comes off the back of all these polls that have been coming out this week. And I think there was a bit of a sense, maybe in Australia especially, because we are removed and we watch from the sidelines. But I remember there was just this real sense of this huge swell of support for Kamala Harris when she was announced or she was confirmed as the Democratic nominee. However, the polls have got them neck and neck in a lot of places. Some places Trump holds a lead, some places Kamala holds a lead. In the national polls, they're kind of right at each other's throats, neck and neck. This is going to be a really tight contest between the two. It is very close, and there are only 38 days till the vote. Can you believe it? In just over a month, we are going to be sitting and watching another US election. Buckle up. And we are finishing on the biggest news for the weekend ahead. Tomorrow's AFL Grand Final between the Sydney Swans, go the Swannies, and the Brisbane Lions. It is officially a sellout. It is tipped to be the most viewed AFL decider of all time because neither team is from Victoria, so everyone's going to be tuning in from either Queensland or New South Wales. Now, we know Katy Perry is the pre-game entertainment, and she dropped an exciting tease, Chris, that she'll be joined on stage by an iconic Aussie female singer. Now, my mind went racing, but there's a hint, and it's that the woman is a Scorpio. Yeah. So this is something I've been closely following. The biggest names that are swirling at the moment who are Scorpios are Tina Arena and Delta Goodrem. Okay, so Tina Arena might come out and do a rendition of Chains, which we know she loves doing. We know Tina loves... We know she loves the sound of her own voice.
Yes, and we know that she loves to bring back Chains at any moment that she can. Now, look, my initial pick before the hint was, of course, Nikki Webster.
Oh, sure.
Because, you know, she rode the Matilda's wave, but unfortunately, I did some digging, she is in fact a Taurus. So Nikki Webster is out of the running.
Okay.
But look, it's an exciting lineup, nevertheless, of Aussies on Grand Final day. So, look, we have Cody Simpson performing the Australian National Anthem, and Christina New and her daughter will be performing together for the Welcome to Country.
Yeah, it'll be a great lineup, and I think a lot of people will enjoy it. Especially nice to see so many Aussies, given that it is Katy Perry. But I mean, that's the thing. Unless you get a big name like that, no one cares about the pre-game entertainment. No one gives a shit. But Katy Perry, woo! All right. Thank you, Chris, for the week. Thanks, everyone. Next up is our deep dive with Liam Flanagan. He's Triple M's Rush Hour host in Brizzy, and we're asking him whether the AFL has won the Code War against the NRL.
Tomorrow is the AFL Grand Final, and it's the first time in almost 2 decades that 2 non-Victorian clubs are battling it out. The Sydney Swans and the Brisbane Lions are 2 of the most supported teams in the code. But even though the Swans have over 1 million supporters, NRL boss Peter V'landys says the AFL's invasion into rugby league states and the hysteria around the code in New South Wales is delusional, which AFL bosses weren't buying. So will AFL ever take over NRL states? Liam Flanagan is one of Triple M's Rush Hour hosts, and he joins us now. Liam, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Has AFL won the Code Wars?
Depends who you ask. It's one of those chicken or the egg. It literally depends who you ask. The reality is AFL is the biggest sport in this country, but it has not won the code wars for the NRL states. Queensland and New South Wales are, and I believe will remain, rugby league states. I don't. It might happen many, many decades from now, but I don't think the AFL can lay claim to having won the code battle yet in those states.
So what do you think it takes to win code wars? Is it like bums on seats, crowd numbers? Is it how many people are playing the game in the grassroots?
It's a bit like, you know, the bosses of the games, Peter V'landys and Andrew Dillon, could probably find a metric that suits them. It's a bit like radio ratings, really. On radio ratings day, everybody wins as long as you find the metric that suits it. The TV numbers for NRL are astronomical, and that's because rugby league is a great TV sport. It's played inline. You don't need as many cameras because the way the sport is played is really well suited to being a TV product, and that is why their TV numbers are so great. They also have State of Origin, which the AFL no longer has, and that is the jewel in the crown of rugby league. And they have an international game as well. It's not as big as some other international sports, but rugby league still has an international football presence. AFL, on the other hand, bums on seats is the metric that they would show as the reason that they're the biggest sport, and they are a truly national sport. They are represented throughout all the states and territories. Obviously, Tasmania's in their not-too-distant future as well. They have academies and they play games up in the Northern Territory, so they are a truly national sport. Participation at the junior level, AFL, I give the nod to, because for those that aren't aware of the Auskick program, this is an incredibly successful program that's being run at the junior level. And that's where the AFL is ahead of the NRL, because the NRL is playing catch-up at a participation junior level. They're making really strong inroads because they've a really astute decision to partner with touch football and essentially take some of that concern that parents might have away from physical contact and head knocks and that sort of stuff by partnering with the non-contact version of their sport at a junior level. So the NRL's making great strides at the participation rates, but the AFL, again, I would give the nod to them as far as that participation numbers at the junior level because of the success of Auskick as a program.
Now, Saturday's decider is the first since 2006 to feature two non-Victorian clubs from non-AFL states. What does this say about the progression of AFL in these states?
It says that in 2024, Sydney and Brisbane are the two best teams. I don't think you can read into it too much. This season has been a really unique season from the perspective of the gap between the best and the worst is probably as small as it's ever been. The quality, the overall, the evenness of the competition is really strong. You compare it to what you're seeing in the NRL, where very much the last 2-3 decades of that competition have been dominated by three teams, the Panthers, the Roosters, and now and the Melbourne Storm as well. But AFL, we see these runs of various teams, and I think for the Sydney Swans in particular, they're a team that since they made the move up to Sydney, they've slowly got their foothold in the market, and it's the people behind the scenes that really deserve a lot of credit for how consistent and competitive the Sydney Swans are without really ever bottoming out. The AFL has things in place so that there is a cyclical nature to the competition, so that no team will dominate for too long, like the salary cap and the draft. But Sydney, with the people behind the scenes, they've got incredible staff at the important positions like list manager, football development officers, all that sort of stuff, which is why they continue to build these great teams. For Brisbane, on the other hand, they've got a really good list as well at the moment. It probably speaks to the fact that they're in the grand final this year, speaks to the fact that these two clubs have managed their lists really well. I wouldn't want to throw a broad blanket and suggest it speaks volumes for where the game is at in these states. So what this grand final probably also says this weekend is that the academy system is working for the non-Victorian teams, and I think you'll start to see some more noise coming out of Victoria about the AFL finding ways to maybe even things up for the Victorian teams, as it were.
Speaking of behind the scenes and all of the work and support that goes in there, Sydney Swans are the most widely supported AFL club. So that's ahead of Collingwood, Brisbane and West Coast. They've got over 1 million supporters. What does that say about the club?
It says they're a very popular, likeable team. They're a really easy team to support. The interesting thing there is they don't have the most members. And that's a really important distinction because supporters don't necessarily put money back into your club. Members put money back into your club. And when you're talking about membership, it's Collingwood, it's West Coast, it's Richmond, it's Carlton. It is the big traditional clubs. Sydney Swans, I think last year, about 40,000 members shy of what Collingwood has. So Collingwood still lead the way. But when the Victorian clubs, the big clubs, want to put themselves up on the podium and say we have the biggest membership, they're right, they do. So do West Coast over in Perth. They are the richest club in the competition. But when you talk about the growth of sport, and we go back to the code war we've already spoken about, for the Sydney Swans to have the most supporters does speak to the growth potential for that football club in that market, and GWS as well. And then when you look further north to Queensland, Gold Coast and Brisbane, there's much more room for all those clubs to grow than there is for the likes of Collingwood and Richmond and Carlton, these teams that exist in an absolutely captured market. But when you look at growth, to go back to what you're talking about, the supporter numbers of the Sydney Swans, Sydney's the biggest city in Australia and there's so many NRL teams, but there is growth for the game of AFL, and you can see that with those supporter numbers for the Sydney Swans.
Jumping back to the Code Wars, ARL Commissioner Chairman Peter V'landys mocked commentary about AFL's invasion into the rugby league states, saying the hysteria around the code in New South Wales was delusional. Is it?
I love Peter V'landys. I think the sport of rugby league, the organisation, the NRL, the ARL, it has never been in a better, stronger position than with this man at the helm. And I think the fact that he engages with these sort of cross-code stoushes the way he does is a great thing. I mean, sport at the end of the day, whatever the code is about entertainment. It's competing with Netflix. It's competing with YouTube. And when you have these very intelligent businessmen and women who run the game, and they're also characters in this entertainment. And I love that Peter V'landys actively engages with these comments that were made by Brian Taylor on Channel 7. For those that don't know, what happened was that there was a final going on at the City Football Stadium, Allianz Stadium, directly next to the SCG, where there was a final going on as well. And Channel 7, the broadcaster for the AFL, had an aerial shot looking down on an absolutely jam-packed SCG, and then it was getting shots of the NRL game going on next door where there weren't as many fans there. That doesn't mean AFL's won the Code War. It doesn't, because Allianz Stadium fits more people than the SCG, so its capacity to take more. But to Peter V'landys' point, yeah, those comments are off the mark. AFL has not won. Sydney is a rugby league city, and I think at last count there's 8 NRL teams, there's 6 NRLW. It is an NRL city, and as much as the Sydney Swans have a really strong foothold in the market, it's still a rugby league town.
I'm going to lean into the more delusional side because I'd like it to be more AFL. But on the back of those comments, though, AFL Chief Executive Andrew Dillon responded saying that this Grand Final, Saturday's game, is predicted to have the highest ratings of all time. Could it be?
Yeah, it probably will, but I don't know if that means that the AFL is doing a better job. I just think, records are made to be broken. I feel like, again, I feel like we almost need an accountant in here rather than, a football commentator, because the reality is these organisations, these broadcasters, we all find a way to make whatever we've just done the best thing we've just done. And with the AFL now having, obviously, Channel 7 being the broadcast partner, will have this available on their free-to-air channels. But then there's also HD channels, and then there's also 7+, and there's so many more avenues to watch this game. And, statistically, there's more people in this country now than there ever has been as well. So Victorians will watch this game because it's their sport, and South Australians will watch this game. You're talking about the traditional AFL markets of Western Australia, South Australia and Victoria. and Tasmania, they will watch this game because they love footy. You've then got participation by the two non-traditional AFL states in New South Wales and Queensland. So it is something of a perfect storm for the AFL to get the most ever eyeballs on a grand final. Add to that, I also think it's going to be a great grand final. We said at the beginning, I think you've got the two best teams capable of playing the best football in the grand final this year. So you add to that, we are forgetting something that will attract eyeballs of the perhaps neutral or non-interested viewer, which is Katy Perry. There's a reason you pay the big bucks to get a huge performer. Like the Killers showed that. If they invest the money to get a big name artist, you will drag more people into the product.
Speaking of Katy Perry, I had to ask about Katy. Some Swan fans are saying that she shouldn't sing Raw. Do you think it would be unfair if Katy sings Raw?
Can I put my tinfoil hat on for a moment and present what I think it's my bold prediction for grand final day? That Katy in the pre-game entertainment doesn't actually perform the song Raw. She holds off on that because if she doesn't sing it, and then if the Brisbane Lions win the grand final, I think there's an opportunity for Katy to then come back out after a Lions premiership win and be joined on stage by some of these brash, good-looking young Brisbane Lions kids, like I'm talking Kai Lohman and Darcy Wilmot. They then perform Raw on stage with her and we get Jack Riewoldt 2.0. This is my hope, this is my dream for the AFL Grand Final.
I think that would be pretty iconic. But look, I want the Swans to win, so I'm hoping that doesn't happen. But if it does happen, I think that would go down in AFL history.
Wouldn't it?
That was Liam Flanagan, one of Triple M Rush Hour's hosts. And wow, I am so excited for this AFL Grand Final. Let us know in our DMs who you want to win this weekend and if you think that AFL could ever take over the NRL states. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it as well. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.